Welcome. Welcome to Sage for This Age, your place in cyberspace where we search for truth and meaning in global politics. Today, we will launch a new series, the IR PhD series. And I have the honor to interview Alexander Chen, who is doing his PhD at the University of Copenhagen. Alex might not identify as an IR scholar. Let's see. But I know that he is working with concepts that are very much IR or IPE in nature, like multi-scalar, economic development, and so on. So without further ado, welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much for having me on, John. And I'm looking forward to this little exchange of ideas.
Nice. My pleasure, my pleasure. Okay, so let's start with a very basic question. There are many master students out there perhaps contemplating whether they should do a PhD or not. So I would just like to ask you, why did you want to do a PhD?
I think perhaps the best way to engage with this question is to think about the positive substantive reasons and also the indirect negative reasons. So if we go first of all in terms of the negative reasons, I have a background in international business and politics, and I specialized in political economy, international political economy during my bachelor and my master's degree. And for many of the other students who pursued this degree, most of them would go into consulting. So during my undergraduate days, I did engage in various forms of case competitions. I had varying degrees of success, but I just couldn't quite see myself as a consultant working within that context. I felt engagement, and this is not to demean the value of consultancies, but I felt that the engagement was a little bit too superficial, and that's why I was seeking some other avenues. So that was the kind of the negative pressure that I realized that the consultancy industry would perhaps not be the ideal for my personality. And then one of the obvious avenues for me to delve into my theoretical interests, which I developed over my bachelor and master's degree, was in conversation with different professors over the years. I was told of the opportunity to do a PhD. So that was an idea that gradually developed. And I gradually also got an overview of what it required to do a PhD in conversation with other PhD students. At the very beginning, for instance, I didn't know that, well, you need references. What are the exact requirements for doing a PhD, right? There are the formal ones, and then what kind of additional things do you need? So through a gradual process in conversation with very helpful professors and instructors, I gradually pursued that goal. And especially during the last year of my master's degree, I also realized that insofar as I want to pursue a PhD degree, I had to also actively try to network a little bit with professors, declaring my intention that perhaps after I finish my master's degree, I would like to apply for a PhD just to examine what available possibilities there are. So yeah, I think I just developed a gradual interest in the possibility of doing it because I always found theorizing and engaging in these IR-related questions, political economy-related questions very much. So yeah, I think that really offers the backdrop against which I ended up pursuing this path.
Okay, interesting. Because for some, doing a PhD is a long-time goal. Some are convinced since I wouldn't say early childhood, but since early on that PhD is the goal. Yeah. But you would say that it gradually came to you.
Yeah, and I think it might have something to do with my social background in terms of my family. So my parents, they are immigrants from China, and when they were raised, it was during the Cultural Revolution. So they don't have as any advanced degrees, university degrees or such. And that meant that I didn't have a very scholarly environment where they would promote reading books or discuss advancing your career through academia. So never really occurred to me that pursuing a career in academia was like a go-to option, that will be a natural progression. I mean, for a very long time, I didn't even realize what was the natural progression between bachelor, master's, and a PhD. And that was until once I started at university, I realized, okay, so this is how things are related to each other. And if I eventually want to become in a position where I can teach or do research, that will require a PhD. So yes, I definitely heard many people who've had this goal from the very beginning. having this idea that they want to research a specific topic, and then they just pursue this goal. But in my case, I just simply didn't know very well about those options.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a gradual discovery.
Okay, thank you very much for that elaboration. So the important topic, or the important question, what is your PhD about?
Yeah, so it's been going through many iterations, and I think I might already say that for anyone who's interested in doing their PhDs, that the initial formulation of the PhD proposal will never, I would say 100%, will never be the same as the final product. And something I will elaborate upon throughout this talk. There has been various hiccups in the process that has made me change some parts of my dissertations. But in very broad strokes, the central premise of my research and my PhD project basically is that China is transitioning towards a tertiary stage or post-industrial phase of development in the post-2012 period. In the 13th and now the 14th five-year plan, there's discussions about the new normal and the need to rebalance the institutional foundation of the economy, renew its economic engines, shift towards a more knowledge-based economy. And what I try to explore is to understand what kind of social-spatial consequences does this transition from a so-called industrial phase of China between 1970s to 2012, and then to the post-industrial phase between 2012 and the present. And initially, I want to look at three types of social-spatial relations: the coastal-inland relation, rural-urban relations, and then the internal reconfiguration of urban spaces, or this post-industrial urban spaces. So it'd be like different vignettes talking about some of these changes. But then now I've focused much more narrowly on one of the dimensions, which is the changing coastal-inland relations. And in that process, I've also worked a little bit with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a natural extension of the same underlying issues, developmental processes that have led China to have a reconfiguration of its coastal inland relationships. So there are three articles where I elaborate on these social spatial relations / geographical relations, and that is concerning A, the changing industrial geography between the coast and inland, and B, the changing logistical geographies accompanying this industrial geography, and then C, finally, the changing employment geographies. So they're all overlapping processes that constitute the capital accumulation processes. And I use the word capital accumulation processes because of my predisposition towards neo-Marxist traditions. Maybe we can have an elaboration upon that in relationship to IR and my use of theory. But I have I position myself within the so-called Variegated Capitalism research program. And that's a research program that has been formulated in response to the varieties of capitalism and tradition. And that's most likely you will encounter that if you have comparative political economy as a course, because it's one of the most dominant forms formulated in the 90s and in the 2000s, which talks about national varieties or ideal types of capitalism. Initially, it was formulated as two national varieties, and then later on it was expanded upon to incorporate emerging economies more recently, with state-permeated capitalism being identified as the Chinese economy. But variegated capitalism tries to depart from some of those assumptions, what I call methodological nationalism. And that is why there's a very strict multi-scalar perspective in my research. So an important feature about China is that, well, China is kind of like a continent disguised as a country. There's a lot of internal differentiation within the country. And the way in which its political governance is organized is also into multi-scalar dynamics, where we in part have central governments, which we usually identify with the nation state as a central actor. But on the other hand, there's also the subnational actors in their capacity as provincial governments. And it's very important if you want to understand China's development, especially between coast and inland and the provinces that constitute the coast and inland, to understand what are the interscalar dynamics that happen between them. So in that sense, a very strict geographical focus on so-called scales.
Okay, so if I just ask a question in relation to what you just mentioned,
Yeah.
so would you say that the varieties of capitalism suffers from this methodological nationalism, whereas the variegated capitalism is more global or multi-scalar in its perspective?
Absolutely. I think that one of the important features of variegated capitalism is that it doesn't resort to a level of latent institutional functionalism, as some of people will call it. So variegated capitalism does not assume that there is homogeneous development of capitalism on the national scale. That is the tacit assumption on the varieties of capitalism, that because of institutional complementarities within a country, then they will converge towards one type of ideal types, one of the many different ideal types. And so those complementary relations reduces transaction cost, and for that reason, there's a push. But in large countries like China, where there's immense variety within the country, when there's this uneven topography, when you look at the coastal areas, it has one institutional setting, it has one model of development. And then when you look at inland, it has an entirely different model of development. It is important to abandon the idea that the national scale is the only scale that matters. And this is by no means an attempt to say that the national scale does not matter, but only that it should also be juxtaposed with other scales, and in particular, the relationship between scales. And so one important characteristic of variegated capitalism is that it has a much more polymorphic perspective of capitalism, that it can develop at various scales. And then, of course, that is analyzed through the lens or through the assumption that we are in a tendentially global capitalist system. So there is, of course, a global spatial division of labor within which the Chinese political economy is embedded. And within the Chinese political economy, there are mutually constituted relationships between the coastal area and the inland area. And just to add on this mutually constituted relationship, and behind this assumption of the mutually constituted relationship between the coast and inland is that when you have to understand, for instance, uneven development, you should not think about them as discrete areas where one has more resources and one has a higher GDP growth and the other one has less. And in that sense, they're just two separate units of analysis. No, there's also an indirect argument. The very reason why the coastal area develops faster is in part because of its relationship to the inland. So in the case of China, since the 1970s, right, one very important feature of this uneven development and this mutually constituted relationship has been that there's been a transfer of migrant labor in inland regions. And that has been supporting China's low-wage labor regime in the coastal area. Now, because China is underwritten by a hukou system, a household registration system that limits access to social rights and benefits, it basically means that when migrant workers move to the coastal areas, they don't take their families with them because children cannot have an education in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangdong province. But in consequence, that means that the cost of the social reproduction of labor becomes externalized to the inland, whereas the surplus value of labor can be extracted in the coast. So in that sense, the very reason that labor is so cheap is because you can externalize those costs to the inland. And through that lens, you see suddenly that it is not just because the coast is more competitive, there's actually, some people use the word core-peripheral relationship between the coast and the inland. So that's some interesting dynamics. So just to summarize, there's the element of this relational ontology, which reflects the idea about mutually constituted relationship between different subnational models, regional models, or whatnot models. And then there is the idea that we are, all countries are embedded in a tendentially global capitalist system. And then finally, the capitalism has to be thought of as a variegated process. And so it's polymorphic. That does not necessarily reduce itself to always a national scale as the primary unit of analysis.
Okay. Thank you again very much for thank you very much for that elaboration. Very in-depth, very interesting. But I have a follow-up question, actually, just to focus on that concept of variegated capitalism, so the students can distinguish between varieties of capitalism and variegated capitalism. And you mentioned as well that you work within the neo-Marxist approach. Would you say that the variegated capitalism perspective is a Marxist approach, or is it a house that can basically house many different scholars?
I would say that it is it brings together a lot of traditions in organizational sociology, in political economy, political geography, and whatnot. Some of the scholars who do work with variegated capitalism, such as Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore, who are some of the progenitors of the theory, have in the past worked with new Marxist context. Bob Jessup, another proponent of variegated capitalism, would also largely be described as new Marxist. By no means.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you. But then, if there are many different scholars, not just Marxist scholars, what would then distinguish a Marxist perspective?
Yeah. So I think in that sense, that is also why it opens up for the opportunity to divorce yourself from what we classically think of as Marxist. I think this is also an important question about definitions of what makes a Marxist perspective Marxist.
Right? Yeah.
And I think that is a very contested issue. I think for some people who identify as Marxist, it is the very focus on the capitalist system as a mode of production and the analysis of its contradictory relations that leads to this tendential instability. That is what makes them Marxist. The premise that capitalism is an unstable system, has contradictions, and it regularly needs to renew itself. That's why regulation theory is one of the, I guess, path-shaping antecedents of variegated capitalism. So if that's the perspective, then I guess variegated capitalism falls into the idea that they assume that, as opposed to the varieties of capitalism, which assumes a static system that stabilizes and coalesces around a stable configuration of ideal typical institutions, then the variegated capitalism departs from that assumption. Okay. Now, to be fair, I would say contradictions and the instability of capitalism, many people would also acknowledge those premises, but not directly identify as Marxists.
Okay.
And in that sense, I would say that the theory of variegated capitalism is not necessarily Marxist as such.
Okay. So it would be possible to be a constructivist scholar working within the variegated capitalism approach or perspective.
I would say definitely there is a possibility to explore specific facets of the variegated capitalism. Okay. And here I would say maybe call it a research program, because different scholars have focused on different features of the capitalist system, of the mutually constituted relations of the system. But in fact, I've heard some people who work on more of the ideational aspects, underwriting regional models. And these are important questions as well, how ideology, state ideology in various Chinese provinces. There's been talk about the Tongqing model and the scandals that ensued. Of course, there's a very strong element of constructivism, ideas, intersubjectivity, and those are relevant research questions which are consistent with the variegated capitalism approach. So I would say tentatively, yes, it definitely is consistent in its broadest terms.
All right. Thank you very much again. And then another question in relation to what you have just mentioned and outlined. What is the added value?
Yeah. So the way I usually respond to this is that there's the theoretical contribution to the existing research program of variegated capitalism. And then there's the more empirical contribution in terms of identifying this new periodization of Chinese capitalism. And people usually don't think of China as having entered a new phase. I mean, everyone acknowledges that there's a new normal, there's a new rebalancing, but they don't really distinguish that as a distinctively different qualitative phase. Very few people think of it as post-industrial. And I think here the concept of uneven development is once again important. And of course, I'll return to the theoretical point by explaining the empirical contribution, because China's post-industrial transition is a very uneven process. Between 1978 and 2012, when China initially industrialized, it was also the coastal region that industrialized first. And they took the so-called get rich first process, right? So this graduated approach that then there will be a trickle down and then inland will develop. So we saw that the coast rapidly industrialized, but the inland was relatively underdeveloped. There were still large agricultural sectors, which also was the reason that the country remained impoverished in many areas. Now, this transition towards post-industrial development also follows a similar format. The coastal region is becoming post-industrial. Since 2013, the service sector, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of GDP growth, GDP value created has exceeded the manufacturing sector. And we see that in the coastal region, it is now becoming post-industrial, especially Shanghai and Beijing, where there's very little manufacturing. But even in areas such as the Guangdong province, there's been an attempt to relocate industries to the inland. So in essence, we see that the coastal region is post-industrializing, while the inland now is more rapidly industrializing. And that, of course, has consequences, as I told you, A, for industrial geography, B, for logistical geography, because if manufacturing now moves into the inland, then there's a need to change the logistical geography. Here, there's an argument to be made about why the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically a way to open up the inland westward. And lastly, of course, employment geography, where they now need the cheap labor in the inland again, and not so much in the coast. So migrant workers who are uneducated or unskilled to a very high degree are being pushed out. So there's a mixture of different observations through the lens of uneven development. So not the whole country is becoming post-industrial. And even those areas in the coast that are becoming post-industrial, it is a relatively recent thing. That I would say was one of the empirical contributions. But then going back to the theoretical contribution in variegated capitalism.
Could I just ask a question about the empirical contribution or the empirical aspect? Would you say that the manufacturing that goes to the inland, is that mainly light manufacturing, like any type of light manufacturing, shoemaking, apparel, whatever it might be, or is it also a sophisticated type of manufacturing, more higher value added type of manufacturing? Or can we see that light manufacturing goes to the inland and more sophisticated type of manufacturing stay around the coastal areas?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a little bit of mixed data on that, but definitely I think there's more of the light manufacturing that's more well documented, and that is also because it more explicitly depends on low wage labor. The high value added activities that involves much more research and development and much more sophisticated production processes to a high degree still remains in the coast, in the coastal area. But there have been some endogenous attempts in various inland provinces to also push for those things. I even just earlier today in South China Morning Post, I read that and Wuhan was trying to make a bid into this global race for chip making. And of course, that ended up in relative failure for various reasons, also because of the pandemic. But that shows that there has been some endogenous attempts also to jump this value-added ladder and to leapfrog a little bit. But definitely, I would say that in terms of value-added activities, it's primarily lower value-added activities that are being pushed inland, whereas the high value activities to some degree, to a high degree, are maintained.
Okay. Sorry for interrupting there.
No problem. So just to finalize the theoretical point, contributions so far on the theoretical front of variegated capitalism applied to the Chinese political economy has been looking at the regional or provincial models of capitalism. So in the Guangdong province, we know the Foxconn, the dormitory model of capitalism. Then we have some more high-tech Silicon Valley, Zhongguancun areas in Beijing. And there's been an attempt to see that there are many variegated forms of capitalist development throughout China. And these things cannot be reduced to a singular logic, such as the label of state-permeated capitalism. So my contribution is, now they make the argument that these different sub-national regional models are mutually constitutive. Together, they form a part-whole relationship that makes the Chinese economy run around. My attempt is to then bring this relational ontology of mutually constitutive relationship and then look instead on coastal inland relations. And that specific thing has not been looked at least not through the lens of variegated capitalism. And those who are more closer working with the Marxist tradition are familiar with the concept of combined and uneven development, which of course are formulated by Trotsky. That is most directly Marxist. And of course, in that sense, and this is once again to establish a connection with variegated capitalism and Marxist, its Marxist legacy in terms of some of the concepts. It has been addressed before, but this attempt to marry these different features about coastal inland relationships and the mutually constitutive relationships of sub-regional models, I would say is my theoretical contribution to variegated capitalism. Or at the very least, problematize it.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading the dissertation.
Hopefully, I will graduate in time, and then it will be around soon enough.
When are you graduating?
Yeah, so I've entered my third year, so I have about 1 year left. I'll probably, well, the deadline is March 2022.
Okay, best of luck. It's not an easy process.
Exactly, yeah.
It's not an easy process. That actually relates to another question. What are some of the challenges that you have encountered on your PhD journey?
The thing here, this can be very valuable input in terms of this very convoluted and tortuous process of doing a PhD, potentially. And this is not to scare people away. But yeah, insofar as my research is about China, 2019, October, I went there. I was supposed to be there for 1 year. And if people can do the math, 3 months later, in the end of January, I was incidentally back in Denmark during Chinese New Year, and the intention was to go back and then stay the remaining 9 months. But I was told very quickly that a pandemic was raging around the country. And I thought what would be a relatively small hiccup to my research process ended up being a very, very long delay. So in effect, it meant that I had to change various parts of my research. Initially, I wanted to do, if you remember, I talked about the internal reconfiguration of the post-industrial urban spaces. And I wanted to do one article based on more ethnographic data of so-called informal, semi-formal food markets that are being subject to homogenization and formalization. So the argument is that in a post-industrial urban space, the value of space becomes much higher, much more scarce, and therefore there's a much more pressure to push for homogenization and formalization. So when people think about China and Chinese food culture, you think about street food, but all these things are not very sanitary. So there's been an attempt under the banner of, for instance, a harmonious society that you would improve those aspects, right? And indirectly that means that specific social classes, migrant workers, are being pushed out of the city and to make it. But yeah, in the end, that part will perhaps wait. Well, maybe for postdocs, maybe never, or maybe in a future context. So yeah, quite a lot of adjustments. Let me think. Yeah, so I mean, it requires, first of all, the willingness also to change. You know, there's a tendency for people when they write a project and they think about it a lot, that you lock yourself in this trajectory. And it's quite difficult to kind of like let loose and then just admit, okay, I will probably not be able to go back anytime soon. Because in January, I thought, okay, maybe I'll be back in 1 or 2 months. But then it was June, and I thought I'll be returning in September. But in September, they still said they didn't want to issue the visa from the research institute I was, and by the way, I was associated with the Sino-Danish Center over there, as well as the Geography Institute of Geography of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And well, it was not possible to get the formalities figured out. And that's why, ultimately speaking, I never returned. As a matter of fact, even all my items are still in China.
Okay.
Of course, made my landlord then take the things and then send it to some Shanghainese family members who now have it in a box, and maybe they'll ship it over here at some point to Denmark again. So
but that is part of the process. Anything can happen. Life is not so predictable all the time, right? And you have to be open to change the project or parts of the project at least. And that also leads to my last question. Any recommendations for students who are contemplating doing a PhD?
I think if you have the slightest inkling of motivation to maybe do a PhD, I think the best thing is just to be inquisitive. If you're not sure if you'd like to do it or not, you should maybe book a meeting with a professor and say, well, actually, I've been thinking about this. I like your course, among other things. I would like to know, for instance, if you work within specific tradition of international relations, or you work with securitization or whatnot, then talk a little bit about what is the state of affairs. Could you push me in some directions? What would it require to do a PhD? And very often they're willing to have a little talk with you. Maybe sometimes in 2 emails, because some professors are busy, and it's not necessarily because they don't want to talk to you. It just gets lost in the email box. It even happened for me, and I'm not even that important yet. So definitely
not yet.
Hopefully. Hopefully one day I'll be in a bit now. And yeah, being inquisitive, ask professors, ask other PhD students if you have them as lecturers. And I think very often they're willing to talk about it. I think I've been asked this question very often, how is it to do a PhD? And I would say one important quality that you probably want to have is to be able to work independently and have discipline. I always tell people, whatever lacks or deficit you have in, say, intelligence, if you're not the smartest person ever, that is not necessarily the barrier to you having a PhD. You can compensate or offset, maybe if you're not as smart as that super smart guy in that department, with a little bit extra work. And all PhDs, they differ in qualities, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it disqualifies you. But insofar as writing a PhD requires a lot of independent thinking, and yes, you do have a supervisor, yes, you are embedded in research networks and whatnot, 80 to 90% of the time you're working on your own, preparing for PhD courses, preparing for teaching, writing, gathering data. And in that sense, you need discipline, because no one will check up on you literally day to day or week by week. And maybe some supervisors, they probe constantly, but some supervisors also push the initiative towards you. If you don't inquire about, oh, should we have a meeting or not, maybe a month will pass where you don't do anything and no one knows. And so because this is this long run process, usually 3 years, if you do it in the Danish context, so 3 to 5 years, and then the real deadline is at those 3 years. And it happens to some people that delays can compound. Some procrastination will lead to a lot of procrastination. So discipline, which is something you can work on already now. Ask yourself, do you have the discipline to do it? And if you have an inkling of discipline, I think then you have at least the most important prerequisites. A necessary but insufficient condition, I'll admit, but that's a good starting point to do a PhD then.
No, that's very important. Discipline surely is the key. Discipline is, and like you mentioned, being inquisitive, being intellectually curious, wanting to read, liking to read, those things. No, that's a very good recommendation. I think, and this is basically the end as well. So I would like to thank you very much for the interview. Really interesting, truly a pleasure, and very interesting research project. And I really hope the PhD goes well.
Thank you very much once again for having me. And it was very nice to talk about these things, and hopefully to the viewers, it will benefit them or maybe clarify some thoughts, or maybe make people interested in variegated capitalism.
Oh, yeah.
Then I've done my job as well.
That's good. Well, thanks again, Alex. All the very best.
Thank you very much.